January 27, 1951. A sudden silent fire blooms miles above the Nevada desert floor. The explosion is so vast, so bright, that it is seen across state lines, a deliberate, repeated act of creation and destruction. We are told it was a necessary step toward peace, a demonstration of power. But what about the people living just over the horizon? How could a government that preached safety systematically expose its own citizens to lethal doses of radiation, then bury the evidence in classified files for decades? The answer is found not in the desert flash, but in the silence that followed. A silence that settled like dust over southwestern Utah, a dust that carried death. The twist is that the very studies meant to prove their safety were the first documents to confirm their poisoning. Chapter 1. The invisible contaminant. The prevailing winds at the Nevada test site, where they conducted 100 atmospheric tests, were supposed to blow east, away from population centers. But nature is not always compliant with military logistics. On May 28, 1957, Operation Plumbob delivered a payload known as Harry. The fallout from that single detonation drifted eastward, directly onto the communities of southern Utah. The radiation itself has no odor, just like sunlight has no odor, but the ionization it caused in the air could make it smell like ozone. Residents smelled ozone and they breathed it in. Within days, the contamination was unmistakable. Residual cesium-137 measurements, taken years later, would trace external gamma radiation exposure across these towns from 1951 through 1958. Children in these regions were breathing an invisible mixture of short-lived radioactive material, most notably iodine-131, the primary culprit for internal exposure. The Atomic Energy Commission, IAC, was swift to respond, not with evacuations but with reassurance. In 1953, AEC officials arrived in southern Utah telling residents, quote, that they could not possibly have been harmed by radioactive dust, adding only that the exposure was, quote, well within the limits of safety. These limits, we would later learn, were self-defined and entirely inadequate for protecting human life. Chapter 2. Project Sunshine and the Bone Banks. The government's concern wasn't just about external dust, it was internal absorption. This led to the initiation of Project Sunshine, a chilling endeavor that began its research in the mid-1950s. This project was not designed to protect the downwinders. It was designed to quantify the internal damage after the fact, using the most vulnerable subjects imaginable. They sought to understand the impact of fission products, particularly strontium-90, on living tissue. Project Sunshine involved obtaining and analyzing approximately 6,000 corpses and bone samples gathered from 26 different bone banks across the nation. It was a morbid harvest, a systematic collection of evidence that had to remain hidden. The program operated with the ethical blindness necessary to treat human remains as scientific data points, all while the AEC was telling parents in Utah that their children were fine. The AEC documents from 1955 illustrate the same systemic focus on product feed forms and logistical efficiency seen in weapons production. They were measuring the residue of death while promising health. The research for Project Sunshine was finally brought to an end in 1958, just as the atmospheric testing phase was concluding, leaving behind a secret legacy of deaths. In the 2 fast years of the activity, a few years ago to this very good moment, book. A reading team for Sakani. The secrecy surrounding these findings meant that local physicians had no context for the rising death tolls, no framework to explain the spike in rare cancers and devastating birth defects plaguing the region. The central mystery was quantified in internal memoranda, later declassified in June 1995 when a Presidential Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments reviewed the files. These documents confirmed the AEC's prior awareness of ethical breaches within projects like Sunshine. The studies revealed specific statistical anomalies, an elevated rate of childhood leukemia, far exceeding baseline expectations in towns like St. George, often referred to as Dirty Harry territory after the notorious test that saturated the area. Furthermore, whispers within these reports spoke of Project 4.1, a related surveillance effort that monitored the health of Marshall Islanders exposed during Pacific tests, foreshadowing the inadequate medical surveillance that would plague the American downwinders. The studies, when finally seen, showed that the death rate was not within limits of safety, but directly correlated with proximity to the fallout plumes. Chapter 4. The silence breaks. For years, the families lived with the grief, the doctors worked without answers, and the government maintained the official lie of negligible risk. Imagine a parent watching their child suffer, knowing only that the government had guaranteed their safety just months before. The doy to sleeve. Shot along honestly in her and said to his understood for the ignated but CBs. The fine black thing in my darkness with gadgets Moses ball. The Dante and really is a scribble. The presence adamant reviewing these torfing parts were on the succade, which came from the trees, the destat of Huswell, the knife from the senior, the assault, the decathlon, the decolorants up to the 3 hours. The document may written quated the Pacific area and governed me treatment muscles for over the deciding is absolutely before the turn lens of beta. The second on the fuzzy ground just to get something that the game could delay when bad. The Duncans reminder home to plan of the foot batting in the question. Where then boy when that's the tumult, the system and the threat of man. Culprit, the bar. The government argued governmental immunity, the impossibility of proving proximate cause across decades of variable exposure, and the inherent uncertainty of radiation science itself. The plaintiffs, often portrayed by defense attorneys as opportunistic profiteers exploiting past national security efforts, faced the daunting task of translating scientific probability into legal certainty. The core difficulty lay in proving that a specific dose of radiation from a specific test caused a specific cancer years later. Yet the sheer volume of documented internal memos detailing safety assurances contradicted by internal scientific warnings began to chip away at the government's defense. Key among the evolving arguments was the concept of fairest causation, that the government's negligent misrepresentation of danger actively prevented residents from taking protective measures, such as moving or filtering water supplies, thereby increasing their ultimate exposure. The legal landscape shifted incrementally. While early cases were often dismissed, the tide began to turn as the scope of the betrayal became undeniable. The legal recognition of the downwinders as a unique class of radiation victims forced legislative action. This pressure culminated not in a grand admission of guilt, but in a series of legislative compromises designed to manage the financial and public relations fallout of the past. The complexity of the damage, the lost years, the chronic illness, the intergenerational effects could never truly be monetized, but the eventual settlements represented a tacit acknowledgement of state responsibility for the toxic legacy unleashed upon them. Chapter 6. The Reckoning of Compensation. The ultimate legislative response came in the form of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RECA, finally signed into law in 1990. This was a watershed moment, transforming decades of anecdotal suffering into quantifiable federal liability. However, the compensation structure itself became a reflection of the government's internal priorities regarding who mattered most. RECA established tiered compensation levels based on defined exposure categories. Those who worked directly on the Nevada test site, the atomic veterans, received a specific level of payment. Those who lived in the designated downwind counties, the primary victims of the atmospheric fallout, were granted a separate, often lower, category of compensation. Crucially, the criteria for eligibility were rigid, based on residency dates and geographical proximity, often excluding those whose exposure patterns were complex or less conveniently mapped by the AEC's retrospective models. For many survivors, receiving the check was a deeply ambivalent experience. It was validation of their lifelong suffering, yet it was often accompanied by the cold, calculating structure of bureaucratic penance. It was not justice, it was indemnification. The process was inherently flawed. Many who died before the act was passed, the first wave of leukemia victims, the parents who succumbed to cancers linked to contaminated food, were ineligible. Their families were left fighting for recognition outside the scope of the act, often encountering the same bureaucratic inertia that characterized the AEC's initial response. RECA served as a partial remedy, an attempt to close a chapter, but it failed to fully address the ethical vacuum created by decades of systematic deception. The ongoing fight for RECA expansion, lobbying